Hey everybody! In this video we'll be making kombucha, which has become a very popular health food drink. You may have seen it in the grocery store. It, in my opinion, should be replacing all soft drinks on the market right now. It is much better for you than any other carbonated drink that you could buy from the store, especially ones with lots of high fructose corn syrup and nasty chemical additives. Kombucha gives you that sweet and tart flavor and that fizz without all of those other things that we would like to avoid. So you have the benefit with kombucha of having a cultured beverage that's full of beneficial yeast and beneficial bacteria. So to make kombucha, it's fairly easy. It's one of the most forgiving ferments in that you don't have to make it as quickly as other fermented beverages. Water kefir is made typically every 24 to 48 hours, unless you hibernate it. Kombucha can go up to a month without needing to be fed. It gets very nice and sour, almost like apple cider vinegar at that point, but won't easily die on you like other cultures can if you don't have the same time to dedicate to them. So when you see our kombucha jar here, this funny looking spongy thing on top, which I'll just reach in and grab, this is called the SCOBY, and this is our mother culture. This is a symbiotic community of yeast and bacteria that float on the top, usually, although it's okay if sometimes your SCOBY sinks down or goes sideways, but usually it floats on the top and will form a barrier between the air and your kombucha. And because the fermentation process of making kombucha is an aerobic process, which means it needs oxygen, it needs to have not a sealed lid, but just simply a cloth or a coffee filter over top. And I just put a coffee filter with a rubber band around when I'm making my kombucha. And that way it can get all of the wild yeasts and things it needs from the air to do its metabolism and create kombucha for you. The first step is to brew tea for kombucha. So you can use almost any tea that you like as a flavor preference. In here I have a mix of some black tea, some green tea, and also a bit of rooibos. And you can use loose leaf or tea bags, whatever you prefer. When you're making a quantity like this for kombucha, you want to be using around 8 tea bags. You can use a little bit more if you like a stronger flavor, or you can use a little bit less. The other thing that is very necessary for kombucha is to have sugar. So the sugar is the main food source that the bacteria and yeast need to create their beneficial constituents and impart them to you. The best sugar to use is simply organic cane sugar. So you can use an unbleached cane sugar, and that's what this is, or you could even use like a rapadura or a panela sugar as well. So I've got the tea bags all ready to go in here. I'm going to add my boiled water and fill that right up to the top. And then I'm going to let the tea steep for probably until, well, about 15 minutes or so, and then I'll remove the tea bags and allow the tea to cool down. You need to make sure that you allow your liquid to cool before you add your mother culture, or you'll literally cook the SCOBY and you won't have successful kombucha. So I'm going to also add in the sugar while it's nice and hot, because that way it'll dissolve a bit easier. You don't have to, you can wait till you strain out the tea bags and add your sugar at that time and just give it a nice stir. But I sometimes find it a little easier just to add it all at first. So I'm going to set this aside and let it cool down. And while it's cooling, we're going to bottle up our finished kombucha that is in this jar here. I'll set that aside over here. So I'm going to set this kombucha tea aside so it can cool down fully to room temperature before we pour it back in with our SCOBY. So we've got our finished kombucha in here, and I've got some various vessels that we can pour it into. I'm going to use a metal strainer. A lot of literature out there will talk about using plastic and not metal. I find this is something that I've never had to pay attention to. It's not touching the metal for long enough to really impart any effects. And in years and years of making kombucha, I've only used metal strainers and haven't had any problem. I do have a problem with buying plastic strainers because they don't last forever and will eventually end up in a landfill. They say that the metal can cause a reaction with the kombucha SCOBY that can sometimes harm the SCOBY, but in my experience, it has never actually occurred. So you want to save about a half a cup to a cup of your finished kombucha in the bottom, and that's going to act as a inoculant of the good bacteria and yeast to get the pH and acidity down to how the kombucha will thrive to continue your next batch. So we'll make sure I leave at least that much in the bottom. And now we have all of this wonderful finished kombucha. Now we can directly bottle it into some flip tops or even just a mason jar, but sometimes people like to take one more step and flavor their kombucha. So if you want to make it grape flavored or black cherry flavored or grapefruit flavored, you can take fruit juice concentrates, or you can take fruit itself and chop it up. You can add some pineapple chunks or some grapefruit chunks or ginger, and then you would allow a second fermentation. So you would take a jar or even another large jar like this, chop up your fruit or your other flavoring plants that you're using and put them in there, pour your kombucha, cap it, and leave it on the counter for at least 2 or 3 days. Doesn't usually need longer than that. And then you would filter out the flavoring fruits or other material that you used and then bottle it at that point. So I'm going to cap this one. And then I'm going to pour this kombucha into this flip top. Having a flip top or something that's sealed will increase the fizziness because you're trapping in all of those gases that are carbonating it. So if you want a fizzier kombucha, a tightly sealed flip top is a great idea for that. And again, check your ferments every once in a while, and if they've been in the fridge for a long time, make sure you're releasing the gases. And if you're going somewhere with a bottle of kombucha on a hot sunny day, make sure it's not getting agitated and shook in your car and then sitting in there, because you don't want to accidentally create a kombucha bomb. And yes, it can happen. If you have a funnel with a narrow lid, you can also make the pouring process a little bit faster on yourself. I find just carefully pouring with one of these glass measuring cups just fine. You want to leave a little bit of headspace at the top, but it's not necessary to leave too much. Just put a little more in that one. There we go. And we'll seal it up and we'll pop it on the counter for 1 or 2 days, and then we will put it in the refrigerator. You can also add a raisin or 2 to fermented drinks, and when the raisin starts to float, you know that it's sufficiently carbonated. I'm gonna fill up the small one. Whenever you have your ferments, you want to make sure that you're keeping them out of direct sunlight. So when we're brewing our kombucha, I will finish by putting a cloth over the kombucha to block sunlight, but when you are using these bottles, because they're only sitting on the counter for a day or 2, keep them out of direct sunlight. So you don't need to worry about having like a green or an amber glass. It's okay to have clear glass for these guys. So kombucha bottled like this and put in the refrigerator will last usually at least 6 months. You don't want to leave it longer than a year, but within a few months is ideal to consume. So that is bottling the kombucha. And we are just going to wait for this to cool down fully before we finish making our next batch. And for now, we'll move on to some of our other ferments. So we've set our kombucha aside and now it's nice and cool. And I'll be able to take the tea bags out and strain them and strain out the loose tea so that we can top it up into our mother culture jar. So I'm going to pour it into here, just so that there's less likelihood of spilling. Give the tea bag a little squeeze. So I'm just gonna move the jar over here so that we don't spill anything. Filter out the rest of the tea. Pour that in. Because I added the sugar with the tea, it's actually a little bit stuck to the bottom. So I am going to add my water into here and give it a little stir to add the last of that sugar and then pour it through the filter. Get as much as we can out. And we'll pour that in. So when you're making kombucha, however wide your vessel is how big the SCOBY will get. And ideally you want lots of surface area because it needs oxygen. So you want to have a wider vessel versus a narrow one. And definitely you wouldn't want to be making kombucha into something that has a narrowing neck because it's going to be very hard to get that SCOBY out. And if any of the liquid evaporates, the SCOBY might get stuck in the more narrow part and then be exposed to air without its natural environment, and then it could go moldy. So you want to make sure that even when you use a large jar like this, that the SCOBY is resting below the spot where the neck starts to come in. And a finished batch of kombucha is going to have all sorts of varying levels of bacteria. So there will be some that are always present, and there will be some that are sometimes present. And it's going to just depend on the types of tea and sugar you're using, the yeasts that are wild in the air, and the bacteria that were already in a symbiotic community in your SCOBY that you were given or that you started with. So the ones that will always be in there are acetobacteria, which are aerobic bacteria that produce acetic acid and gluconic acid, and Saccharomyces. So that's a number of yeast strains that produce alcohol and are the most common types of yeast found in kombucha. So your finished kombucha will be between 1% and 2% alcohol. So keep that in mind when you're giving it to children, that you're not giving them a large volume. That's why the other ferments like water kefir or the pineapple bubbly that we made are sometimes more appropriate for very young children than kombucha if they're consuming a large quantity of it. So when you're finished topping up your SCOBY, you want to make sure that you're covering it again, not to prevent air, and that's why I use a coffee filter, but you do want to protect it from flies or fruit flies or other little critters that might think it's a good idea to crawl inside and wreck your kombucha just by getting in there. So a simple coffee filter with an elastic band is my favorite way to do that. And then you want to put a cloth over top just to prevent direct sunlight if you're leaving it on your counter. And you leave that for anywhere between 7 to 10 days, and you can leave it even longer, up to 2 or 3 weeks if you want a really acidic, more vinegary tasting kombucha. But for those of you who want something to mostly replace soda, still be kind of sweet, then about a week is all you'll leave it for. So yeah, that's kombucha. Thanks everyone for joining me, and have a wonderful day.